That's better, I hope. Yeah, the microphone is now working. Fantastic. So this is the replacement lecture for September 14th, 2015, International Health. There is a blackout campus, and so I had to send everybody home. And everyone's kind of happy about that. I'm not, because I have to read to all of this now in the comfort of my own home, but during the time I was going to spend drinking. I mean, sleeping. I mean, doing other work. Yes. So as I'm talking to you, I am actually loading up the Blackboard website so I can make an announcement about this video that's happening right now. So bear with me as I type. Subject will be blackout lecture. And I'm going to type, you can watch the replacement lecture live right now or later on YouTube. So, and I'm adding the YouTube link, and I'm pressing submit, and we're off. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do is open up my screen sharing. And I hope I don't share anything too embarrassing on my personal computer. So let's find out. I'm sharing the, I don't want to do that. Let's try this again. I'm sharing this. Great, you can see that now. Present to everyone. Hopefully you can see that. So I'm now going to present. That's not working, is it? I'm going to stop sharing. Entire screen. No. Okay. Great. So I'm not sharing the screen. Let me just try something out. Next screen. Great, it's working. Okay, fantastic. So today what we're going to talk about is following up from our last lecture, which was the introductory lecture. We were talking about some of the sources of income inequality, some of the sources of health inequality. And I want to start today by asking you that same question that everyone always asks you in every single health sciences class, and that is, what is health? And you're going to give me the same old answer, which is the WHO definition, which is health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. Now, I believe I have one viewer right now. If that viewer could let me know if there are any technical issues having to do with whether or not you can see the slides, that would be great, because I need to know if there are any issues. Okay, back here again. Okay, so why is this particular definition so important? And the reason is that if you look carefully, it opens the door. It opens the door to political machinations. For example, based on this definition, if I were to ask you, is having a responsive democratic government, is that a health issue? Might be. According to this definition, it might be. And as a result, several international health organizations have taken political matters under their mandate because, according to this definition, why not? If your government does not treat you well, that may lead to your poor health. On a more inclusive or less problematic level, behaviors become health issues. Do you smoke? That's a behavior that leads to poor health. Are you employed? Is your employment status relevant to health? People in this program know all about the social determinants of health, and of course, we know that in fact employment and all those other factors are relevant to health. And that all stems from this definition. It's inclusive. It allows us to bring in under the umbrella of international/global health pretty much everything that relates to people. Now, as I mentioned last time, when I say international health, most people think of this. They think of poor, starving children, usually African. And I want to suggest to you that international/global health is a lot more than this. It's about health disparities, and health disparities exist worldwide. There are gaps between the poor and the wealthy everywhere. And I'm quite happy that in the last couple of years, that's become a prominent feature in our media coverage. Pretty much no election campaign is carried out in North America nowadays without the question of income inequality coming up, and that hasn't been the case for a while. There are rich nations and there are poor nations, and the gap between the two are enormous, and there are nations within nations. What am I talking about when I say nations within nations? I'm talking about the First Nations, most commonly. I'm talking about our Aboriginal people. I'm also talking about any community within a given country. So in almost every nation, women's health and men's health are approached differently, as we know, and I'm going to beleaguer that point. But here we see the gap between rich and poor. Here's some old stats. We see that from 1984 to 99, the gap between the top 20% of earners in Canada and the bottom earners was quite large, 43%. In later years, it actually got higher. So that gap is widening. My question to you is, do you think this is because the rich are getting richer or the poor are getting poorer? In Canada, it's actually because the rich are likely getting richer. So this is the income of Canada's top 1% of earners. As we see, it's gone up since the 80s to the present day. At the peak in 2006, it's come down slightly. But the gap between the two groups has risen substantially. And so income inequality is an issue even here in the heart of wealthy North America. As I mentioned last time, income inequality is perhaps the the most proximate cause of health inequality. If you're rich, you're probably healthier than if you're poor. Not always, but probably. There are nations within nations. Here we have almost 20% of Canadian children live beneath the poverty line. We're going to talk later on about how we measure the poverty line, and this is an old statistic, but the number is still quite relevant. About a quarter of all our First Nations children live beneath the poverty line. That's shameful. There's something called the Human Development Scale. It's a combination of access to services, quality of life, and so forth. In general, Canada ranks usually quite high in the world, around in the top 5. Last I checked, we're number 4. It's probably changed since then. But if we looked at just our Aboriginal communities, they'd be ranked at number 78, beneath Kazakhstan. Again, that's shameful. So we have essentially a developing world context right here within our own border. The gender gap we talk about a lot in our classes, but it's worth pointing out again. It's a prominent global health issue. And here are some of the things to think about. Research on health interventions is done predominantly on males, and we assume women are just a different kind of man. And that's not the case, as I hope you understand. And so much of the research is not applicable to women, even though we assume that it is. Women have fewer educational opportunities than men on a global level. In Africa, here's an interesting statistic. Women are responsible for 80% of food production, but they own less than 1% of the land. And that is a problem. And, you know, it's not just about women doing poorly, it's about men doing poorly as well. Men are more likely to die at work, men are live less long. Domestic violence is borne mostly by women, public violence is borne mostly by men, and so forth. So there are differences between the two. I'm not saying one has it worse than the other in all cases. I'm just saying they are different experiences. So what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that issues of population health disparity are not strictly those of rich versus poor countries. We can see the things that we're going to talk about in this course, issues of disparity, of inequality, right here locally. And this is relevant for a lot of reasons, one of which is it's so commonly I come across people who want to go abroad to do good in the world. I can't blame their motivation, but really if you disassemble what it is they actually want, they want an exotic experience. If you want to help someone disenfranchised and struggling, there's a homeless shelter down the street. There's an abused woman center down the street. There's your neighbor who probably needs a good talking to. There's a depressed teenager who probably needs an intervention. So if you want to help people, you can do that right here. You don't have to go abroad. There's struggling happening right here. And the larger lesson there is that these distinctions between us and them, as I hope you will learn to embrace and absorb, are largely artificial. So there is definitely, though, a gap between rich and poor nations. We cannot deny that England is richer than Mali, and the typical American is wealthier than the typical Sudanese, right? So different countries have different pathways to experiencing wealth. How did this come to pass in the first place? That's what we're going to talk about a little bit right now. If you excuse me, I'm going to check my email for the moment to see if anyone's been trying to contact me. No one's been trying to contact me. That's good. Okay, good. Right. So essentially, I'm asking, why is the third world the third world? I know that's not an appropriate terminology to use anymore, as we learned last time, but this is an old phrase that's been brought up in the past, so I use the same phraseology. And that brings me to mentioning the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals. Let me just check back for a second. Great, we have one viewer. Wonderful. Okay, so the Millennium Development Goals came about as a result of the Millennium Declaration, which was the result of the UN having a special meeting around 2000, where the signatories agreed to 8 important goals. And these goals were this: they're going to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger, focus on primary education, promote gender equality, reduce child mortality, improve maternal health, combat HIV and malaria and some of these historic killers. And they're going to ensure environmental sustainability. And lastly, do something around global partnership, whatever that is. Okay, I'm skipping over this quickly because it's not relevant to this particular lecture, but the MDGs have really shaped much of the large-scale global health interventions of the last 15 years. Now we are transitioning to something called the Sustainable Development Goals, a larger list of goals that nations are going to try to embrace to direct their adventures in global health. This is from the Millennium Declaration. These are the specific outcomes of the MDGs. Among them, to have by the year 2015 the proportion of the world's people whose income is less than $1 a day, and so forth. You can go down that list and see there are specific outcomes that were expected by 2015 and 2020. It's 2015 now. Have these goals been met? Sometimes they have been, sometimes they haven't. And there's a lot of political questioning, logical questioning, agenda-driven questioning around, were these goals rational in the first place? And we will revisit this question in a future lecture, but I want you to start thinking about that right now. So look at this graph. This graph shows us, it plots life expectancy on the vertical axis against income, or GNI, gross national income, on the x-axis. What we see is something quite distinct. There are 2 curves happening here. There's a dramatic increasing curve and a more stable plateaued curve. What we think is the story being told by this curve is that the infectious seems to be one experienced strictly by the low-income nations. And these are nations that have poor health. Life expectancy here is being used as a proxy measurement of health. And we can argue over whether that's appropriate. In fact, a future lecture, I will deconstruct how life expectancy is computed. And we see in wealthier countries, they tend to have a higher life expectancy, but a different disease profile as well. So there definitely is a distinct experience between low-income nations and high-income nations when it comes to disease profile and life expectancy. So where does wealth disparity come from? I will suggest to you it comes from a series of vectors, a series of forces, historical and otherwise. Here I've got things like a history of colonialism, which will be the focus of the rest of this lecture, something called the brain drain, which we'll talk about later, national debt, environmental degradation, military overspending, corruption, and so forth. So let's talk about colonialism. What is colonialism? I would argue that many of the disparities seen today are the result of a history of colonialism experienced over the past 500 years. Now, colonialism is not just about European colonialism over non-European nations. That's how we tend to think of it today. But to be fair, there have been colonies as far back as antiquity. Carthage was a colony of Tyre. India had colonies in Southeast Asia. China briefly had colonies as well back in antiquity. But when we're talking about the states of health and wealth today, we're largely talking about the experiences of colonial powers, i.e. European powers, exerting force and influence over non-European nations over a process of colonialization of the past couple hundred years. The question that tends to divide people on a political basis is the extent to which colonialism is still responsible for wealth disparities, because we no longer live in a colonial era. We live in a post-colonial era. So European colonialism started in the 15th century, in the era of Columbus, the age of discovery, right? That's when the great explorers of the European age were out discovering, quote unquote, discovering new lands, particularly in East Asia, South Asia, and the Americas. In the 19th century, we had the industrial age, and that led to a new kind of imperialism. This is when a new kind of colonialism accelerated, particularly in Africa. And we're going to talk a little bit more about Africa in particular. Then we saw in the past 150 years or so a process of decolonialization. This is when these nations that were once controlled by European powers have acquired supposed independence from their colonial overlords. So let's go back for a second here. There are two kinds of colonies, right? There's a kind of colony where you send your people to another land to create a new nation. Then there's the kind of colony where you essentially conquer another land. So Canada is a colony of England, mostly, and of France, secondarily. And most people here are descendants of the people brought here from Europe hundreds of years ago. That's the first kind of colony. Somewhere like India is a second kind of colony. That's where the British arrived and essentially layered their administration on top of an existing society. So Australia, United States, Canada, New Zealand, these are all the first kind of colony. India, Egypt, pretty much all of Africa, Indonesia, these are all the second kind of colony. So I think you can tell from that list, there's a distinctly different experience between the two lists. The first kind have done well economically. The second kind have not, because the second kind, I would argue, were established for the purposes of extracting resources, whereas the first kind were established for the purposes originally for extracting resources, but then for the investment in the growth of a society. So we're here to talk about the second kind of colonialism, the kind where European powers essentially conquered and controlled other nations. So there are competing views about why they were able to supplant these other cultures. And I would categorize these views into three categories. The first is that somehow the Europeans were innately superior. The second is that it had a philosophical advantage. And the third is that they had an environmental advantage. Now that first category, I would say, is a racist category. And I would not accept it. And in fact, there is no scholarly evidence for this being the case. People are people. There is no innate superiority in different kinds of people. None have ever been demonstrated. So I would not accept that as an argument. If you're going to argue this, I hope you have extraordinary evidence to bring to bear. The second two I'm going to explore right now, though. So the philosophical advantage tends to be championed by those right of center, conservative thinking, and is championed by the likes of Victor Davis Hanson, who is a military historian, and they hold that there are certain characteristics of Northern culture, and Northern culture is European culture, that make them quote unquote superior. Those characteristics, these individuals would argue, are political freedom, capitalism, individualism, that is the sacrosanctness of autonomy, of individual expression, republicanism, meaning they're separate from nobility and kings, rationalism, meaning they're separate from religious thought, and lastly, open debate. The argument here is that these characteristics allow society to be technically, scientifically more robust, therefore militarily robust, therefore commercially more robust. People like Neil Ferguson, who is a historian, would argue that there are, he calls them killer apps, 6 killer apps for the quote-unquote superiority of the West. And these individuals tend to define superiority in terms of prosperity. So he says the West, i.e. the North, i.e. European powers, had embraced competition as a core value. They had embraced science, i.e. rationalism. They support and recognize property rights. So if you work hard and create a patch of land and you earned, the state will support and recognize your ownership of that land. as an incentive. Modern medicine, he argues, is a characteristic that makes the North/West superior. A consumer society leading to capitalism and a stronger work ethic, he would argue as well. Again, I'm not saying these are right. I'm saying these are the different viewpoints. The environmental advantage is argued by people like Jared Diamond, who wrote Guns, Germs, and Steel. If you haven't read this book, I recommend that you do. It's a fun read. And he argues that Eurasians, meaning people in Europe, particularly around the Fertile Crescent area, got a head start in developing the things that caused them to be wealthy, and the things that caused them to be militarily proficient by virtue of certain geographical advantages. First is the discovery of high caloric, robust grains around the Fertile Crescent. And the second is the ability to spread those grains to North Pole's cultivated maize or corn, that's their high caloric grain. But because North America is narrow and runs north-south, you couldn't spread the corn beyond really the Mexico area. Further, more north and more south, the climate changed too much. So you're stuck developing in one particular area. Whereas in Europe/Asia, you have a large east-west spread. So any 2 points of latitude, you get pretty much the same amount of sunlight. Therefore, you can get pretty much the same kinds of crops. Once you find a robust, good crop in Europe, you can spread it pretty much all across Europe. Then there is the availability of large domesticable mammals, things like the horse and the cow and the ox and the sheep and the pig. These are all found in abundance in Europe and Asia. They're not found in North America. North America had only one large domesticable mammal, and that was the llama. Now, the power of having these animals is that they can provide work. And if you can work a farm, you can produce more calories, you can grow your civilization faster. The other thing about mammals that are important is that once you have a close association with animals, you are developing a more robust immune system. So he would argue, and many others argue as well, that the European and Asian history with living in close proximity to lots of domesticated animals eventually led them to have more complicated and resilient immune systems. And that led to the first international health crisis. The Europeans arrived in the New World in North America after Columbus. It was European diseases that wiped out most of the natives here. It was not native diseases that wiped out the Europeans. And the question that scientists had for some time was, why didn't North American diseases attack the invaders? But the invaders' diseases, like pneumonia, like smallpox, devastated the natives of North America. And the reason, many people think, is that the Europeans, the Eurasians, had more robust immune systems. Again, this is all speculation still, but it stands to reason. So those are the two competing viewpoints when it comes to why Europe was able to conquer the world in those 500 years or so. So that's the history of colonialism. Let's talk about how that history affects wealth disparity. As I mentioned, there are two kinds of colonies. There's the types of which they're the same race and culture versus different race and culture. And we're talking about the kinds in which they're different races and cultures. Again, England dominating India. Colonies exist to service the colonizer. England did not go to India to benefit the Indians. They went there to extract resources. Let's make that clear. And the resources are transferred from one direction only, from the colony to the colonizer. India made Britain wealthy. In fact, Britain was enormously in debt before their conquest of India, and Indian jewels paid off British debt. And the conquered community is decapitated. What does that mean? It means that in the process of conquering, you're pretty much killing off leaders. So after several generations of offing the local leaders, you tend not to have the same amount of robust leadership that allows a community to return to its feet as quickly as one would have hoped. So another thing that happens over time is the brain drain. Again, look at England. Look at what's happening right now in the schools, in the professions of England. They're dominated by former colonies. Indian doctors, African lawyers, Egyptian merchants, all people from the empire have returned to England and have brought their abilities. So very often the flow of resources is not just in terms of materials, it's in terms of people. As I mentioned before, someone like me, I'm an example of the brain drain. I've come from Guyana. I left when I was a child, but I'm supposedly a well-educated, high-value individual that perhaps, historically speaking, should have remained in the country of my birth, but I'm here benefiting Canada, I hope. Right. So this has also led to corruption. So if you have separated out the quote unquote best and the brightest from a nation and killed off its leadership, what remains is going to be a corrupt set of individuals enacting the policies of the colonizer. And that has long-standing effects on the ability of such a nation to manage its wherewithal, to manage its resources, and to emerge in the 19th century from under the yoke of colonization. Now, capitalism was also foisted on these nations because before that they had a variety of different kinds of economic processes involving trade, sometimes bargaining, sometimes bartering, sometimes degrees of socialism, sometimes outright capitalism. But with the arrival of European-style colonialism, it's outright capitalism, where we are going to sell you these items at the highest possible prices because we can. And that also led to environmental degradation. So in Africa, there was a dramatic remaking of the countryside for the purposes of creating certain kinds of crops. So there are different kinds of views here. I'm summarizing one particular view, but if you're looking for the other argument, there's a myth of neocolonialism, which you can read at this site here. You can read an article by Dinesh D'Souza called Two Cheers for Colonialism, and a response to that article by another individual. Dinesh D'Souza, you have to understand, is one of Reagan's former advisors. I think he's in jail now for something, so take that for what it's worth. I'm not a fan, obviously. You can read about colonialism was good for Africa by this individual. Be warned that some of this language in this article could be seen as racist. I think it is. And if you're really keen on this topic, you could read The Betrayal of Africa by Kaplan. And I think this is a very good book that really explains the effects of colonialism from Africans' perspective quite well. So one of the ways that colonialism affected some of these countries is through the redrawing of borders. And this is probably one of the most obvious ways to explain to somebody new to the topic how a colonial influence can affect a colonized country's ability to manage itself, ability to manage its own citizens, ability to relate to one another, and its internal economics, politics, and health stats. So the European powers drew new borders all over the world: Asia, Africa, Americas, everywhere. These borders were remade for European political need. They're not made typically for the needs of local population. Borders are cut across tribal lands. They certainly force two warring tribal peoples to be together, or they separate one tribe into new different countries. One day you're living in something resembling harmony in your community. The next day, you and your neighbor live on opposite sides of an international border. And this is quite problematic. They tended to ignore natural geographical boundaries. These are just lines drawn across a map. One of the most problematic episodes of redrawn borders was during the independence of India. So when India drew its independence from England, Pakistan was extracted from that same land, but the borders between Pakistan and India were drawn in an office somewhere in London in a way that was very problematic. It led to a lot of violence. By some estimates, millions of people died from the forced migration of non-Muslims from the new Pakistan back to India, and the forced migration of Muslims from the new India into Pakistan. And that's a very sad moment in history that probably could have been avoided with a little more circumspect drawing of the borders. So Africa was redrawn most dramatically by the Europeans at something called the Conference of Berlin in 1884. This is part of a historical process called the Scramble for Africa, where during the 19th century, European powers literally scrambled to get a hold of as much of Africa as possible. And ever since then, Africa has experienced at least 103 wars since the Conference of Berlin. At least, those are the official ones. There are some skirmishes that we probably wouldn't count, but that's a lot. Over 100 small wars caused, experts say, as a direct result of problems caused by these redrawn borders. And here's an example. This is from Wikipedia. This is Africa in 1914. 90% of the land here is controlled by European powers. The big blue chunk is French. The pink chunk is British. The yellow chunk is Belgium, and so forth. So you see all the European powers have grabbed their bits. And this is probably a clearer map that shows the names of the countries that were formed from this redrawing. But Africa is just an example. So in 1763, the Treaty of Paris actually carved up a lot of the rest of the world, including Canada and parts of Asia. So key exchanges of property included India, Sumatra, the Philippines, the Caribbean islands, and so forth. Right. So there's a lot of trading and swapping of territory happening around then. If you ask yourself, why do they speak Dutch in parts of Indonesia? This is why. Some Dutch islands were bought from other powers. And in fact, very famously, an island in Indonesia, I think, was traded by the British for Manhattan. So Manhattan used to be Dutch, used to be New Amsterdam. And today, of course, it's the most valuable piece of land in the world. So sometimes these trades were not good ones. Okay. So then we have the conversion to cash crop agriculture. I mentioned that Africa, the landscape was remade. What's a cash crop? A cash crop really is something that's grown for export, not for local consumption, right? So you make it for cash. Historically, we grow crops to create food, to feed people locally, and to export what's remainder to make a tidy profit. A cash crop is made strictly to make money, usually for export. Now, do you know what the world's most legally traded commodity is? Sorry, the world's most second legally traded commodity. It is coffee, right? And coffee is a classic cash crop. The world's most legally traded commodity, you probably figured out, is oil. But coffee is number 2. There are lots of things that are illegally traded. I won't mention what those are, but you get an idea. So there's something special about coffee. Coffee, you can't eat. You don't get calories from coffee. You just get money. So land that you dedicate to create cash crops is land that you're not dedicating to create calories. Other cash crops, things like sugar, cotton, things like that, right? So by the 19th century, Europe was resource poor. In fact, the forests had been cut down, the mines had been exhausted, and so forth. But European industry still needed natural resources, particularly from Asia and the Americans and Africa. So that's one of the driving forces of the new imperial era, a desire to get resources, to create goods, to sell, and to maintain your wealth. So colonization of Africa in this time was a direct result from a desire from Europe's industrial sector to get more of these natural resources. So the thing about colonization of this nature is that it allows a colonial power to get a guaranteed market for their goods. So not only can you extract those natural resources from the colony, you can make the colony buy back the products you created from it. Right? Look at this little map here. So the green arrow is the flow of raw materials from Africa, of the colony, back to Europe, and the blue arrow is the flow of value-added goods back to Africa. So a value-added good would be a table that's created from wood. The wood has value. The value added is the workmanship added to the wood to make a table out of it. Okay. So as you can probably tell from this cycle is that slowly you're getting wealth sucked out of the colony. So we'll go back here for a second. The thing about this that's important is to note that this is not free enterprise. You're limited, the colony is limited in terms of who it can buy its products from. It can only buy from the colonizer. So they set the price. There's no competition. You have to buy your table from the colonizer. It wasn't just crops. So Zambia and Congo colonized for copper and minerals, which are raw materials. Angola, Kenya, and Zimbabwe for coffee and tea. Senegal for nuts, and so forth. Malawi, tobacco, and so forth. So all of Africa was being remade as just a resource producer for the colonizer. The thing about a cash crop economy is that land that was previously used to grow diverse food crops is now used just a handful of things for export. You can't eat much of these things. You can't eat coffee. You can't live on sugar. You can't eat cotton. right? Lands were given by the colony to large corporations for large-scale production. So the country where I'm from, Guyana, that was remade into a sugar plantation. It's all, and big corporations run the sugar. Have you ever heard the term big sugar? Well, there it is. Big sugar comes from this idea that big corporations run sugar. Rice is produced by small family-run undertakings at the local village level. So rice you produce a little bit for export, but also for consumption. Sugar you produce for export. Local farmers are forced to give up their land and work on these big farms. So forced economically, not a gunpoint, at least not usually, but sometimes. Here, as I mentioned, the free market is not in play. So you have to accept the low prices for finished goods. If you're buying that table from Europe, it's going to come at a high price, but your raw materials are going at a low price. If you can't grow enough to feed yourself, you're going to have to buy food from abroad. You will find in many of these nations, if you can go to a coffee producing nation, it will be amazing. You will not be able to buy coffee. If you go to Guatemala, Nicaragua, it's hard to find locally grown coffee unless you go to a specialty store. Most of the coffee is exported. You will drink crappy instant coffee that's been imported from Europe. Isn't that amazing? Right? Because you export your good stuff and you buy the crappy stuff to sustain yourself. This leads to malnutrition. If you are too poor eventually to buy this food from abroad. And this leads to bad health outcomes as a result. Right? I'll give you an example from my work. So I work in Guyana, and I'm with Aboriginal peoples in the interior. What we have there are mining companies, often Canadian mining companies, which will show up and suck the men from the villages to work in the mines. They offer a higher wage, a moderately higher wage, and if you're already poor, you're going to be tempted by that scenario. So the men leave their villages and go work in the mines. And when they leave their villages, they leave food production. So the food that they're making doesn't get produced. Instead, the money they make from their mining now goes to buying food from the European companies and the Canadian companies from the coast. And the food that you take in the interior is not good food. It's packaged, it's processed, and so a lot of health issues arise from this. On top of that, you have men separated from their families living in mining camps, and that's attracting prostitutes to migrate in from Brazil. And the prostitutes bring with them diseases and other issues, and the prostitutes also are not recognized legal migrant workers, and so they get no health services. It's all a recipe for bad health for everyone involved, for the men who are the miners, for the prostitutes from Brazil, and for the men's families left back in the villages. This case study, I won't go too deep into it. It just talks about a cap economy in Tanzania led to mass migration to plantations, and that left no domestic food production, and that left a need to work harder and to migrate further. And it's a vicious cycle leading to malnutrition and increased poverty. So colonialism ended supposedly in the 20th century, but the economic systems that it created are still in play. So the nations that I mentioned a few slides ago still produce those products. They haven't returned to a more diversified, robust economy, at least not entirely. So the former colonies need to borrow money to restructure their economies. They borrow that money from the former colonial powers, and that has led to a debt cycle. So there's still a reliance by these now independent former colonies on the wealth and oversight of their former colonial masters. So something to think about. Today's agriculture is a reflection of trading policies made centuries ago. Okay, the fact that Guyana still makes sugar and not a more robust, diverse set of products is problematic, but that was the reality of 300-400 years ago, and we're still living that reality. Poor health, poor agriculture leads to poor nutrition, which leads to poor health. So, is the legacy of colonialism always bad? It's hard to say. So, here's an example here. Because this particular colony, Rwanda Urundi is called, didn't have a lot of natural resources, it didn't attract a lot of colonial attention. So as a result, the colonial power that was in charge of that area, Belgium, had no incentive to invest in public health or educational infrastructure. So maybe the argument is that the poor health infrastructure in Rwanda is a result of the failure of the Belgians to be sufficiently colonial. That's an interesting argument. I don't know what to think of that, but it is kind of curious. So to say it again, it's possible that if you have nothing to offer a colonial power, they in turn won't spend the money to improve your infrastructure to get your stuff out. And in return, 200 years ago, you can't benefit from that infrastructure. I don't know. It's an interesting argument. So to what extent does today's powers infantilize former colonies? I would like to you to look at how European and American political speeches talk about African nations, right? They're always talking about how they need help, right? How we have to do something. You know, it's look at the language. There's infantilizing language happening there, and oftentimes is a broad brush. We talk about Africa, not the nations of Africa, and of course, I'm sure there's some people in this class who probably didn't internalize the fact that Africa is not a country, it's a continent, but that's a common finding. By the way, if you write in your essay, if you refer to the country of Africa, better beware. That one statement is going to drop your essay down to letter grade. Okay, it's happened before. It happens in this class, but it still happens. Okay. So I usually, at this point, have you watch this Hans Rosling video. And it shows, up until 1948, it shows the effects of colonialism on health. If this was in the class, I'd watch it with you. It's not, so just click on it and have a look yourself. He's a great guy. Things for you to think about. What is our role in addressing the disparities we just learned about in terms of colonialism, right? And efforts to change the effects of colonialism, can they be affected at an individual level or a national level? I mean, are your personal purchasing decisions, are they relevant? And I want you to think about what can be done in the future, policy initiatives. So those are all of my slides. Oh, look at that, that's amazing. Oh, I'm back here again. So hopefully that worked. Hopefully you saw the slides. I'm not sure if you did or not. This technology sometimes doesn't work. And if not, I'm not doing this again. So I'll see you in class, and yeah, hopefully it won't be a blackout next time.